Hello, everyone. So we're going to get started now. So this is the Mathematical Spaces for Conscious Experiences Symposium. This is a symposium that was co-organized by Johannes Kleiner and me, Andrew Lee, and that also has Catherine Talon-Baudry and David Rosenthal. And the basic idea here is that we all think a central goal for the science of consciousness is to investigate the structures of conscious experiences. And a crucial part of this project, you might think, is the use of mathematical spaces, sets of elements endowed with some structure to model conscious experiences. So all four of these talks are going to be about that unifying theme.
Yes, I'll use this mic.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. So welcome also from my side. I had to push Andrew to the side because I just took a few notes here. I want to say apologies about that. Yeah, it's wonderful to see so much interest. Hi also to the other room. I hope you can hear us. If not, just run up and knock. Yeah, so the fundamental motivation behind the symposium was that we saw that there's an increased interest in the use of spaces for consciousness science across fields, basically. So it's psychology, philosophy, I'm jet lagged, sorry about that, mathematics, neuroscience. In all of these fields, these ideas came up. And there are various different proposals, like, for example, quality spaces, there are multidimensional analysis of conscious states, there are topological tools, as we'll see, for experiments. And of course, there's also theories, like IIT, we use spaces of states of consciousness to be very broad. And so we felt that at this point, there are very good ideas, but the research really is fragmented. Everyone works with their own idea, with their own space. And so we thought we'd propose a symposium to sort of put people together, bring in people. We would have loved to include many more, but of course time is limited and we can only have 4 speakers. But our aim is to build a common terminology, and our aim is to identify the basic empirical and theoretical questions that we think should be addressed in a cross-disciplinary manner. So yeah, thanks very much for being here, and yeah, we hope you enjoy. And I pass over to David, who's the chair of the first session.
Thank you very much, Johannes. It's a pleasure to introduce Catherine Talon-Baudry, who will talk about the topological space of subjective experience.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Johannes and Andrew, for putting this symposium together. Thanks for being here. I heard when people were arriving that it's about mathematics. I'm not going to understand anything. So there isn't much mathematics in my talk, or at least not really apparent. And I would like to begin by a little bit of personal history. Yeah.
And I just need to do share the screen here. And presentation.
Okay, so I guess here many people are interested in how the brain is producing these subjective experiences. And actually, I began in this field about, I don't know, 15 years ago. And I was quite naively expecting my slides to be able to explain this type of subjective experiences, like work of arts or that I really like. And I ended up doing gamma patches. I think most of you are more familiar with gamma patches than with this work of arts. Say something about our field. But there was a logic to that. We were all doing more or less gamma patches because we wanted to reduce the complexity. We are attacking a problem which is extremely complex, so using simple stimuli seems like a very good way to go. But this had, I think, consequences. So I will try in the next slide to go through the different steps we have in a typical experiment on visual consciousness. So we have a stimulus which is extremely well defined in physical space along dimensions like contrast, orientation, or spatial frequency, so that we can locate the stimulus precisely in this physical space. Then this stimulus generates and interacts with neural activity, some magic happens, and there is a subjective experience. We would like to understand the magic, so we ask participants to report. And then we have reports like there was something, there was nothing. Then we go back to the neural activity and search for neural activity which matches this pattern. So this is all very basic. Then some people did more clever stuff like using graded reports, like with the path scale, so that you could go for more parametric analysis with potentially some nonlinearities. And this research program to which many of you here contributed generated tons of results. It was to the point that it could also be used in no-report paradigms, and we get correlates of consciousness before stimulus onset, during stimulus presentation, after stimulus presentation in different locations, at the front, at the back, in different types of neural activity, in evoked responses, in brain oscillations, or in my case also in how the brain responds to heartbeats. Okay, so we got a lot of interesting results, but there was an underlying assumption, or rather an approximation, which is that subjective experience is 1D, or at least that we can project subjective experience along this one-dimensional line, which does have consequences in how we analyze the data. And I think this had profound implications in how we consider the neural correlates of consciousness. So this has been very useful, but it has consequences. And there are also now ways to move forward, which rather come from, not from consciousness studies, actually. And so I just want to show one example from vision science, from the very nice series of papers from Hebart and collaborators. And so what they did is that they presented natural images like those here, and they actually presented them in triplets. And the task of participants was to say, which is the odd one out? So they did that with a huge number of natural images and collected a large number of judgments. And the reason why I think it's very relevant for consciousness studies is there are multiple reasons, but one of them is that the answer to this odd one out task is very subjective. I don't know how many of you would choose the pretzel, for instance. No one. Okay. Who would choose the doormat? I would. And who would choose the koala? Okay. So distributed. So there is some intersubject agreement, which is everything is based on this. It's the study done across multiple subjects, but those are still subjective responses. And what they worked on was to then define similarities. So like, for instance, here, most of us agreed that we would consider the doormat to be the odd one out, so that those two objects are more similar than the doormat with the pretzel or the doormat with the koala. Not exactly, okay, I'm just simplifying things. So they extracted similarity measures across all those natural images to reduce the data on, to show that the data can be reduced to 49 purely data-driven and also meaningful dimensions. And what is interesting that some dimensions are kind of expected, like we get the animal dimension, where the most typical objects are animals, but others which are more considered to be low level, colorful or round or primes and patterns, I would say less cognitive dimensions, and also some unexpected ones like things valuable. And each image can load on different dimensions, like this fish loads on the animal-related dimension, but also on the water-related. And this plate of noodles loads on food-related, but also on repetitive and stringy. And if we go back to our beloved Gabor patch, it would then probably fall onto the round dimension and also on the repetitive one, which is quite different from just being present or absent. But they went a step further, which I think is very relevant for consciousness science, which is that if now they consider each image separately with this kind of rose pattern, they can group images that have similar rose patterns, which is what is being shown here, where here, for instance, there are tons of different images loading high on the animal-related dimension, but only on those dimensions, so you have the most typical mammals. But then the fishes are here with the animal and the water-related one. Here you would get the insects and so on. You also see some global patterns which are expected with all things man-made in one region and all things living in another region. So they are, by similarity, you can get clusters of related objects, but also to get an idea of how, looking at the distance between clusters, how things are organized in general. So this is coming closer to getting an idea of what is a subjective space for this particular task and for these particular images. And there are some nice features, like for instance, if we look at things that are food related, which are those orange lines, we can see that they fall in different clusters with man-made things like pancakes or zucchinis, which load also on the plant's dimensions, or that body parts and clothings are close together in this space. So this suggests that rather than considering a few dimensions, we can get some interesting structure that I will summarize in a very crude way by this kind of drawings where things cluster, but there are also connections between clusters represented by their distance. Something very similar happened in affective science in this paper by Cohen and Keltner, where they presented videos, short clips like here, for instance, that someone is driving and the truck brakes, and this car goes from the leftmost lane to the rightmost lane very quickly, probably generating a lot of anger in the driver. And here it's a harbor scene, and then there are some bubbles, and suddenly a wave emerges. And here it was a similar idea. They had loads of videos and participants, and they asked ratings, but also spontaneous verbal reports. Which is something really interesting because now there are tools to analyze spontaneous verbal reports, which have drawbacks like any tools, but that are nevertheless interesting tools. And similarly, I'm just zooming on a small subset of results they obtained. They could represent each video on the space that is organized along 27 semantic dimensions. And there is the same idea that there are clusters, like here, all those letters F corresponding to anxiety would cluster here, but there are smooth transitions between anxiety and fear, for instance, or from surprise to anxiety, or from surprise to fear. Okay, so similar ideas coming from the affective science. So if now we go back to what we're doing in the visual neuroscience of consciousness, which is that if we start from stimuli, no matter whether it's a GABA patch or an actual image, it's not so much the image itself, but how we analyze them. And we start from the subjective experience, but this time we ask for different types of reports. Like this odd one out task or spontaneous verbal description. It means that we have now ways to go back to some idea of how this subjective space is organized, which is crucial if we want to go to the neural correlates, because now we can work backwards to try to determine where in the neural activity we can find something similar to this. Okay, so this is of course technically challenging. There are some tools which have, okay, and then hopefully some of the magic will disappear. It's technically challenging in the sense that those are two complex spaces. There are some tools which have been around for quite a long time and that some people here in the room use beautifully. There are others which are equally available. But more generally, I think it's also cognitively challenging because when we think about the variables and the concepts in cognitive science, we try to have maximally distinct variables and concepts. And here, this is not the type of space where things are necessarily maximally distinct. And so it's not only that it's technically difficult, but it's also challenging to saying that we are not trying to tease things apart, but trying to say how we can put those things back together. Which also means that we are going back to one of the crucial questions in cognitive neuroscience, which is how does the brain manage different dimensions and their relationships? So this is not a new question. It's been around for a very long time, and there has been proposals, and one of them is that there is a progressive convergence of information up to cells which are really specialized, like in identifying some specific persons, for instance, as the so-called grandmother cells. This certainly exists. If we ask then how can the brain do that in a flexible manner, for instance, with an object or a scene you've never seen before, this is getting a little bit more complex. And one of the proposals is that the temporal profile of the firing of neurons might be relevant for this, and there has been a lot of studies on the hypothesis that binding could be done by oscillatory synchrony, for those of you who are familiar with this. And ultimately, the question we also have is what distinguishes conscious and unconscious, obviously. Because those first two questions can be asked without resorting to anything specific to being conscious or not. Also, flexibility starts to hit on the question of consciousness. And so the proposal we are developing in my group and trying to test, but it's really at the level of an hypothesis at the moment, is the idea that maybe some of this binding, which is necessary between different groups of neurons, could be achieved with bodily signals. So this seems a little bit far-fetched. So I want to take a while to go through this idea with you. So in consciousness science, there is an interest to try to think about how we could build a subject of experience, and the idea has been around for quite a long time, and Olaf Blanke is over there and has been very instrumental in finding evidence for this, that bodily signals might play a role, because actually we tend to think about the brain as floating by itself, but it's actually embedded into an organism. And bodily signals, because they are intrinsically internal and private, to be self-specifying. And the idea that it goes from defining an organism that needs to be protected, that needs to be fed, etc., to a minimal form of self. And so there are a number of bodily signals which have been considered in my group. We work mostly on the heart and the GI tract for two reasons. First one, they are organs which are life-sustaining, so probably of strong relevance for the brain. But also because they are electrical pacemakers, so they have a life of their own, and they continuously send information up to the brain. But there are many other interesting candidates in the body. It's a hugely complex system. And so we can measure, for instance, how the brain responds to each heartbeat. So this is an example in somatosensory cortex where if we consider the electrocardiogram, so here the heart contracts at the RP, and we can record an evoked response to the contraction of the heartbeat. So it's a signal which is present about every second in the brain. And I won't describe the experiments, but through many experiments, we could find a link between the amplitude of this response and subjective aspects, either of spontaneous thoughts or on the distinction between self and other, or in the group of Olaf on the bodily self, or even on subjective perception. There is another type of relationship which has been observed between the rhythm of the stomach, which I will show you here, and the neural activity, showing that the phase of this rhythm constrains the amplitude of higher frequency brain activity. This has also been shown with respiration. And the reason why I'm compacting a lot of information here is that if we look where this has been observed, and I'm sorry, this is maybe a bit small, but it doesn't really matter what it is. So in red, you have heart-evoked responses. In blue, where coupling with respiration has been observed, and in green, where coupling with gastric rhythm has been observed in both human and animals. And what is very striking in this picture is that all external sensory cortices are involved in this. So that if we look at visual cortices, for instance, it has been observed responses to heartbeats, coupling with a gastric rhythm and coupling with a respiratory rhythm. And I see puzzle faces. Yes, this is usually not how we view those signals. We would typically think, well, signals from the body, that's just very low level. It's all done subconsciously in subcortical regions, which is not the case, simply not the case. So the hypothesis, I'm going to present might be entirely wrong, but those facts are real for sure. And so the idea is that because we get those bodily signals in occipital cortex, but also in the auditory cortex or in somatosensory cortex, huge evidence for it. Those are in olfactory cortex as well. And there are, of course, other places like some nodes of the default and salience network and the limbic regions. But it's essentially excluding the most cognitive regions. And one of the possibilities that we would like to explore at least is that those bodily signals might be used for binding, because if they get expressed in regions where we know that typically the coordinates in the visual cortex are very different from the coordinates in the somatosensory cortex, having those signals represented in the two regions at the same time might help going from one system of coordinate to the other. So this is completely speculative, and I won't show you data, and it's not even a theory because it's just a vague hypothesis. But what I think is interesting in this hypothesis is that it could explain some properties of subjective experience. So the fact that it appears unified, but also that it's in first-person perspective. Because those signals have a very strong link with the bodily self from which first-person perspective emerges. And also that for conscious perceptions, this intrinsic mindness, so the fact that whenever you experience something, it's your experience, except in pathological cases, and you don't have to think about it, it's really intrinsic to any conscious experience. So this could also be accounted if the binding is achieved by bodily signals. And this could also explain why in a number of psychiatric disorders, there are actually a huge number of issues with bodily signals as well. So I will finish by thanking people in my group who contributed to those ideas and to the experimental data that I actually did not show. And just to make sure that you don't get bored during the question, I just want to give you the names of the artists from the beginning. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have almost 5 minutes for questions. These microphones work? Yeah. Great. Okay. Questions. Please.
Could you give us an intuition?
Can everybody turn on the microphone when they talk with the, yes.
So thanks for the talk. I was wondering, given that there's some time, if you could give us an intuition of the kind of experiment you have done just to have an idea of the way that you've related these signals.
Yeah, so I mean, if I had the right experiment to prove that hypothesis, for sure, I would have shown it.
No, but to explore them, yeah. Just to explore them.
But in a nutshell, this is coming from two lines of research. One line of research is really disconnected from anything about consciousness. It's mostly experiments done in rodents, just showing that there is coupling with the respiratory rhythm in many regions. And actually, it happens that most of those regions are sensory regions. And we find the same thing with the gastric network in humans. So if we look at brain regions whose time course or whichever feature of the time course follows the gastric rhythm, this happens in all sensory cortices, which is very unexpected. So the idea that they might be used for binding information from those different sensory cortices is interesting, but there's no definite proof. But the other line of research is about heartbeat evoked responses, where here, this would have been another talk in a different symposium, but we are not allowed to speak twice. So I'll give you the brief version. So there was a whole research program in my group where we looked at whether heartbeat evoked responses predicted or covariate with a number of subjective aspects, perceiving or grading at thresholds, but also giving preference judgments or subjective decisions, or thinking about yourself, or imagining yourself or someone else, or judging your own emotion versus judging the emotions of someone else. In all those cases, there were specific variations of the heartbeat evoked response, which were related to the subjective aspect, whether perceptive or more cognitive.
Thank you.
Is there a question back here?
So when you talk about the topology, like what kind of space you are in? Like you can have like the case you show is a behavioral space, like the subjective, like it's on their behavioral like activity space, but like you can also have a topology on the neural activity space, the spiking, but you can also have activities like in terms of connections, like the fMRI data, you can draw out like topology from that. Like, so when you talk about topology, they're in a space, like, and then they have transformation with each other, and then you can transfer from a linear space, and then you get something you get into like somewhere else. But so when you talk about like topology in a space, like what exactly space are you talking about? Or
yeah. So thanks for the, I'm not trying to thank you for the question, because it's clear that it's not very, no, it's not, it was not very specific in my talk, because I would certainly not pretend that I know exactly what we should be doing first. But the idea is that now that we have, we know some things about the topology of brain organization, but we know very little about the organization of subjective space. And now with those tools, we can have better access to it. So trying to go from one to the other, which transformation would be the best one, I'm not sure, but certainly something which is very concerned about neighborhood relationship seems important. So that's why I used the word topology, but it's quite mathematically vague. The specific type of transformation that should be considered, from my perspective, at least, is pretty vague at the moment.
So that's the time we have for questions. Now, there will be, as everybody knows, 15 minutes for questions at the end.
If I could just mention in between, there is you turn off. Oh yes, okay. There's an overflow room. There's an overflow room in 204 for people who don't want to stand on the side. There you can follow the session as well through Zoom, and then you can just have a comfortable place to sit in a chair. You're welcome to stand in the back, but yeah, just so that people know.
Yeah, everything's working.
Okay, thanks very much again to the three. So we're chairing ourselves, so that's why we see a little bit of rotation here. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Lee, and he's going to speak about dimensions of consciousness. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So let me start with something that I think probably most of us will agree on, or at least that I think is true. An important task for consciousness research is to identify the dimensions of consciousness. But if you ask researchers what they think the dimensions of consciousness might be, you'll not only get wide variation in the answers, but also wide variation in interpretations of the question. So for example, here are some of the most common answers that you'll see. Sometimes people will talk about level and content of consciousness. Sometimes people will appeal to different sensory modalities. Sometimes people will talk about spatial experience and temporal experience, and so on. And each of these answers is very different, not just in the answer itself, but also in the construal of the question. So you might wonder, what exactly do we mean when we talk about dimensions of consciousness? How do we decide which of these answers is correct? And what does it even mean to give a correct answer in the first place? And could it be that multiple answers are correct? So the goal of this talk is to provide an analysis of what dimensions of consciousness are and to show how that analysis can clarify and disentangle different tasks for consciousness research. And let me be clear from the outset, my goal isn't to provide a list of dimensions of consciousness, although I'll mention some plausible candidates along the way. Instead, my goal is to explain what it even means to talk about dimensions of consciousness in the first place. Because unless we're clear on what we're talking about, we're going to be at risk of searching for answers when we don't really even understand the question in the first place. So here's a good starting point. Here's a first pass definition. You might think a dimension is a way in which things vary with respect to some kind. And I think that's pretty good. I think that pretty much gets things right. But I think this first pass definition also leads to some puzzles. It's not quite satisfying as a final analysis. And the basic reason is that there are innumerably many ways in which conscious experiences vary, but not every way in which conscious experiences vary seems an equally good candidate for being a dimension of consciousness. For example, let's say you're tasting Vegemite and I'm not. Well, then our conscious experiences vary, but Vegemite phenomenology seems like a pretty poor candidate for being a dimension of consciousness. On the other hand, properties like valence or degree of attention, those seem like especially good candidates for being dimensions of consciousness. So one thing we want is an analysis of dimensions of consciousness that can identify which ways of varying with respect to consciousness are in some sense more important or more privileged or more joint carving. Also, you might wonder, is there any sense in which consciousness might turn out to be low dimensional? I mean, you might have hoped that identifying the dimensions of consciousness, that's going to help us in developing systematic models of consciousness. But if it turns out that there's just innumerably many dimensions of consciousness, then you might think that our hopes for a simple, elegant theory of consciousness just kind of go out the window. So let's do this. Let's put this first pass definition down at the bottom. It's going to be the guiding intuition for a more systematic analysis that will enable us to solve some of these puzzles. Now, if we're trying to understand the notion of dimensions of consciousness, there's two natural sub-questions to ask. What do we mean by dimensions? And what do we mean by consciousness? So that's going to be the structure of this talk. First, I'm going to talk about dimensions, and then I'll talk about consciousness. It's useful to start with some initial examples. So there are some phenomena that we think of as unidimensional. For example, mass. These are properties such that things that have that property vary in only one way from each other with respect to that property. And there are also other phenomena that we think of as multidimensional. For example, color. These are properties such that there are multiple ways in which things that have that property vary from each other with respect to that property. Now, there's also properties such that there are zero ways of varying with respect to that property. I think these are best classified as zero dimensional. And these might feel like edge cases, but I think they'll actually be relevant later on. And then there's also properties such that there are infinitely many ways of varying with respect to that property, like shape and function. I'm not sure yet if these will be relevant to consciousness, but I've included them for completeness. One important question here is, what are dimensions of? In other words, which kinds of things have dimensions? And I think there's basically two natural answers to this question. One is properties and the other spaces. So properties like mass, color, personality, consciousness, and spaces like the real line or the Cartesian plane or physical space or space-time. Now, consciousness is a property. If there's something it's like to be an entity, then it has the property. If not, then it doesn't have that property. So if we're inquiring about the dimensions of consciousness, then we're inquiring about the dimensions of a property. But also, every property is associated with a space of values, where you can think of values as ways in which that property can be instantiated. So for example, the property color is associated with the space of all different color values. And that observation enables us to connect the property-focused way of thinking about dimensions with the space-focused way of thinking about dimensions. And it enables us to bridge the notion of dimension that applies to properties that I'm talking about here with the mathematical notions of dimension that occur in, say, topology or linear algebra or statistics. But what I want to focus on here is properties, because my question isn't what are the dimensions of our mathematical representations of consciousness, but instead, what does it even mean to talk about dimensions of consciousness itself? There's a lot of questions that we could ask about the structures of dimensions. For example, we might wonder whether dimensions have to be degreed or distanced, have to have zero values, have to be orthogonal, have to involve aggregation. I'm actually going to skip these for purposes of time. Instead, I'm going to consider just one case, color and hue, that I think is illustrative and that will be an example to motivate a more general notion of dimension. So think about how hue is a dimension of color. So this claim is true, but what exactly does it mean? What are we committed to when we say that hue is a dimension of color? Let me make 3 observations about the structural properties that we implicitly have in mind when we say that hue is a dimension of color. So first, think about how no individual color can have multiple hue values. That's part of what we mean when we say that hue is a dimension of color. That's a property that I'm going to call incompossibility. Second, every color has a hue value. That's a property that I'll call universality. And third, whenever there's a difference in hue, there's a difference in color. That's a property that I'll call variation. And my view is that these 3 structural features, incompossibility, universality, and variation, they're not just incidental features of the relationship between hue and color, but instead they capture what it is to say that hue is a dimension of color. And we can use that to construct a more abstract definition of dimension. So here's my analysis. What it is for a property D to be a dimension of a property F is for D to be a universal set of incompossible values that captures variations with respect to F. So that's kind of technical, but this is really just an abstraction from the 3 observations that I made on the previous slide. So there are 3 principles here. Incompossibility, no F has multiple D values. So that means if something is a dimension of consciousness, then that means that no conscious thing has multiple values along that dimension. Universality, every F has a D value. So if something is a dimension of consciousness, then every conscious thing must have some value along that dimension. And variation, D differences are F differences. So every difference in the dimensions of consciousness must entail some difference in consciousness, meaning some difference in what it's like. I think this gives us a general analysis of dimensions that we can apply to consciousness. And I think this analysis is useful because it places substantive constraints on what it takes for something to be a dimension of consciousness. And that helps us solve one of the problems that I started the talk with. There's innumerably many ways in which conscious experiences vary, but not every way seems to be an equally good candidate for being a dimension of consciousness. Now, there's more I could say to defend each of these individual criteria, but I won't for purposes of time. Instead, I'll just say that I think this analysis strikes a balance between 1, capturing ordinary and scientific uses of the term dimension, 2, identifying a natural structural kind, and 3, giving us a useful and precise tool for theorizing about consciousness. And also, I'm not saying that there's just one permissible way of using the term dimension, but I think this is a definition that is both intuitive and precise. So that's my analysis of dimension. And really, this is just a way of precisifying the guiding intuition that you see at the bottom. A dimension at first pass is a way in which things vary with respect to some kind. So let's replace the first pass analysis at the bottom with this more precise analysis. And going forward, I'll just take that analysis for granted, and now I'll move on to consciousness. And at the beginning of the talk, I said that, well, if we want to think clearly about dimensions of consciousness, then we should figure out what we mean by dimension and figure out what we mean by consciousness. And some of you might be thinking, it's easy to figure out what we mean by consciousness because obviously we mean phenomenal consciousness, where an entity is phenomenally conscious just in case there's something it's like to be that entity. We've all read our Bloch and Chalmers and Nagel and have clarity on the concept of phenomenal consciousness now. And I mean, I think that's basically right too, but I also think that even after we identify the phenomenal sense of consciousness, there's still an ambiguity that matters for thinking about dimensions of consciousness. And to explain this ambiguity, I want to start with a popular and common metaphor. The metaphor is that to be conscious is for the lights to be on inside. I think this is a good metaphor. I mean, sometimes people poke fun of metaphors like this, but I think this metaphor stands up to philosophical scrutiny. And I mean, even if you think the metaphor is flawed, you could still think that it captures something intuitive about the concept of phenomenal consciousness. But one thing that I've realized is that there's actually two ways of interpreting this metaphor. And I think the distinction matters when we're thinking about dimensions of consciousness. And to see the distinction, suppose we ask, what exactly is consciousness within this metaphor? I think there's two possible answers. One is that you might think of consciousness as the inner light itself. If we think of consciousness in this way, then we can define consciousness as what makes an entity feel like something at all. But on the other hand, you could think of consciousness as the whole illuminated room. And if we think of consciousness in this way, then we could define consciousness as how it feels to be an entity. So let's call the first interpretation of consciousness subjectivity, and the second interpretation of consciousness phenomenal character. So subjectivity, on the way I'm thinking about it, is itself an aspect of phenomenal character, just as the inner light is an aspect of the illuminated room. But there can be differences in phenomenal character without differences in subjectivity, just as there can be differences in an illuminated room without differences in the inner light itself. So I think both of these are perfectly fine ways of interpreting the term phenomenally conscious. I mean, a few people I've met have been kind of skeptical of the distinction and have said to me, it's obvious which of these is the right interpretation of conscious. But the problem is that different people have differed on which interpretation they think is obviously correct. So I think that's evidence that both are okay. Also, this distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character, I mean, we can think about it more theoretically as well, because it arises across basically every theory of consciousness. For example, here's a bunch of prominent theories of consciousness nowadays in both the science and the philosophy of consciousness. And here's what those theories identify subjectivity with and what those theories identify phenomenal character with. And to take just one example, let's think about global workspace theory. So suppose global workspace theory is correct. Suppose that to be conscious is to have a global workspace. Well, we could still ask, what is consciousness if global workspace theory is correct? I mean, one answer is that it's the global workspace itself. And that's a natural answer because having a global workspace is what makes an entity feel like something at all and is what divides the class of conscious entities from the class of non-conscious entities. But another answer is that consciousness is not just the global workspace itself, but also the representations in the global workspace. And that's a fair answer too. Because if we want to know what it's like to be an entity, then we have to look also at the representations inside the global workspace. So in short, I think consciousness in the phenomenal sense is ambiguous between expressing subjectivity and expressing phenomenal character. And what that means is that if we're asking, what are the dimensions of consciousness? Then there's two interpretations of this target question. What are the dimensions of subjectivity? What are the dimensions of the inner light? And what are the dimensions of phenomenal character? What are the dimensions of the illuminated room? So I'm going to say a little bit about both of these, and I'll start with subjectivity. If we're asking what are the dimensions of subjectivity, I mean, how we ultimately think about this is ultimately going to depend on which theory of consciousness is correct. And that's because every theory has a different answer as to what makes an entity feel like something at all. And that's just the definition of subjectivity. But I want to briefly mention three theories: predictive processing theory, integrated information theory, and higher order theory, to showcase a range of possibilities for what the dimensionality of subjectivity might be. So here's the first case. Suppose that you're a predictive processing theorist, and suppose you think that to be conscious is to have an internal model of the world. And suppose you think that two entities can differ in the contents of their internal models, but they can't differ in the having of the model itself. This would be a picture where the inner light is just either on or off. there are no other settings for the light. I mean, the room that's illuminated, that can differ. The contents of the internal model can differ, but the light itself just has one value. So that's a picture where subjectivity is zero-dimensional. The space associated with subjectivity is just a single point. There aren't ways of varying with respect to subjectivity. On the other hand, suppose IIT is true. Suppose that to be conscious is to have a maximal phi value. And famously, maximal phi values can be higher or lower. And when it's higher, the system is more conscious according to IIT. So this gives us a picture where the inner light has a dimmer for brightness. The light shines more brightly in some systems than others. And it gives us a picture where subjectivity is one-dimensional. Or think about higher order theory. Suppose that higher order theory is true, and suppose that two subjects can differ both in the number and the strength of their higher order thoughts. That gives us a picture where subjectivity is multidimensional. The light has settings for brightness and color, maybe strobe, and other things as well. So basically, we have a range of different possibilities for what the dimensions of subjectivity might be. But notice something here. All of these examples are low dimensional. And at the beginning of the talk, I asked if there's any sense in which consciousness might turn out to have a low number of dimensions. And I think this is one sense in which that might turn out to be the case. If we're thinking of consciousness as subjectivity, then it's just an open question whether consciousness is multidimensional or one-dimensional or even zero-dimensional. Okay, so let's return to the metaphor. To be conscious is for the lights to be on inside. I've been talking about one interpretation of the metaphor, where consciousness is the inner light. And it's pretty straightforward to think about dimensions of consciousness when we're thinking of consciousness as subjectivity. But let's now turn to the other interpretation of the metaphor, where consciousness is phenomenal character, where consciousness is analogous to the illuminated room. It's much less straightforward how to think about consciousness if we're thinking of it as the illuminated room. But one way to make progress on this is to try to disentangle different aspects of the illuminated room. Well, one aspect of the illuminated room is the inner light itself. In fact, the inner light is actually a dimension of the illuminated room. If you look at my analysis, then that satisfies the definition of dimension. So that means that subjectivity is itself a dimension of phenomenal character. But there are also other aspects of phenomenal character as well. And I think we can get insight into these other aspects by following through on this metaphor. So think about an illuminated room. It's natural to identify two other aspects of the room besides the inner light. There's also the objects within the room, and there's also the space that those objects occupy. And I actually think that all of these aspects of the metaphor have theory-neutral analogs in their interpretation. So subjectivity is the inner light. Phenomenal character is the illuminated room. Subjectivity is a dimension of phenomenal character. But let's set aside subjectivity and focus on other dimensions of phenomenal character. So I'll use qualitative character to denote the aspect of phenomenal character that I think corresponds to the objects in the room, and locative character to denote the aspect of phenomenal character that I think corresponds to the space that those objects occupy. So as examples, think about spatial experience and temporal experience and bodily location experience for locative character, and color experience and auditory experience and pain experience for qualitative character. I think this distinction between qualitative character and locative character is quite intuitive. I mean, just think about the differences in phenomenology between these different categories. But I also think there are more precise and principled ways of distinguishing qualitative character and locative character, as well as subjectivity, just as there was a precise and principled way of defining the notion of a dimension. But for purposes of time, I won't get into that. Instead, the main point I want to make is that if we're asking what are the dimensions of consciousness, the question looks very different if we're asking about dimensions of locative character versus qualitative character versus subjectivity. And I think this helps clarify why you see such different answers in response to the question. When people are asked what are the dimensions of consciousness, sometimes people are focused on locative character, sometimes qualitative character, sometimes subjectivity. Now, in a longer version of this talk, I talk about another distinction that I think cross-cuts this set of distinctions. The other distinction concerns what I call dimensions of atomic experiences versus molecular experiences versus total experiences. but I won't discuss that for limits of time. Instead, I just want to highlight what I think is the most important distinction out of all of these, which is the distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character, between the inner light and the illuminated room. I've argued that both of these are reasonable ways of interpreting the term phenomenally conscious, but they yield very different ways of thinking about what the dimensions of consciousness might be. Now, subjectivity is itself a dimension of phenomenal character, so this diagram illustrates the relationship between the concepts. In addition to subjectivity, there's also qualitative character and locative character, the objects in the room and the space that those objects occupy. And at the very beginning of the talk, I said, I'm not going to give you a list of dimensions of consciousness. Instead, what I've tried to do is clarify how to think about dimensions of consciousness in general, no matter which kind of theory you favor. And I think I've provided some ways of solving the puzzles that we started with. I asked if there are senses of dimensions of consciousness where not every way in which conscious experiences vary automatically counts as a dimension of consciousness, where dimensions of consciousness are in some sense more privileged or joint carving, and where it might turn out that consciousness is low dimensional. And I think that drawing these sorts of distinctions will help us think more clearly about the structure of consciousness and help us move forward in consciousness science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Wonderful talk, as always. And we're going to have time for one question. So only raise your hand if you think the question is really important. And Andrew, while people ponder on this, could you give me the microphone and maybe use that one to answer?
Sure.
And David, if you could come up already, we can get you ready. So who thinks that question is really important? Like raise your hand really hard. Yeah. Okay. Let's go with. All right. Yeah. So I'll pressure. Okay. So Andrew, you wanted to use your account of dimensions to help us figure out which dimensions would work. Can you use your microphone so the other room can hear you? Yeah. So do you want to use this? Or would you rather use one of those?
Okay. Hopefully people can hear me. Okay. So Andrew, you wanted to use your account of dimensions to help us figure out which dimensions of consciousness would be more joint carving as opposed to lame or trivial. And so I'm going to try to give an example that, given your account of dimensions, a lame or trivial dimension of consciousness turns out to be joint carving or satisfy your criterion. Okay. So here's my dimension, whether the experience is had by Andrew. So this is a zero dimensional, zero degree dimension on your proposal. So is it universal? Well, every experience is either had by Andrew or not. It's universal. Okay. Is it incompossible? Yes, because every experience is, no experience can be both had by Andrew and not had by Andrew. Okay. So then this is all going to boil down to whether it's a variation. So the question now is whether an experience is had by Andrew a way of differing with respect to some other property, right? And I was thinking the property would just be it's a way of differing with respect to consciousness. Now, I admit I'm not totally sure here, but what I'm worried about is my intuition that this is not a way of varying with respect to some other property is really driven by the following thing. I think this is a lame or trivial dimension of variation. So what's going on here is your account isn't telling me which dimensions are joint carving or not. It's like I already know which dimensions are joint carving, and that's inputting into your theory. So my worry is that your three accounts, I mean, I like the idea of universality, incompossibility, and variation, but it's not solving the problem you advertised it to help me solve.
Thanks. So I'll try to answer really quickly. So the short answer is that the analysis was not intended to provide necessary sufficient conditions for what it is for a dimension to be important as opposed to lame. So I'm happy to say that there are some lame dimensions, like an experience had by Andrew, that might satisfy the
totally lame
analysis. Instead, the analysis is intended to provide clarity and precision on what it is to say that a property is a dimension of another property. I think that there's going to be further constraints, like finding natural dimensions or finding dimensions that generate good models that will allow us to disentangle the lame properties from the cool properties.
Okay.
Okay, so let's give it up for Andrew. Thanks very much.
Just a quick reminder for people who came in later, there is an overflow room where Zoom is presented with this talk in 204. For people who are standing or sitting on the floor, you can have a comfortable seat over there.
Okay, and now a super short introduction so that we keep on a track of time. And we now listen to David Rosenthal on quality spaces and the appearance reality distinction.
Thank you very much. Can you give me some help?
Yeah, something I'm wondering.
Yeah, I can't read the top.
Sorry, the Zoom bar is yeah, let's get rid of that Zoom bar. How do you get rid of it? I think it should just disappear.
Well, I won't read the bottom then.
Is it okay if I try to do it like this?
More?
No, because then I can't read the bottom.
More?
Yeah, hide.
There's a hide button. Oh, wonderful. Load meeting controls. Yeah, there we go. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. It's useful to individuate metal qualities by relative location in a quality space, but there are serious methodological issues about how to construct such quality spaces and how this device works.
I think we should click into the window once. Now you're good. Yeah, perfect.
I'll argue that the best empirical technique relies on just noticeable differences construed as being between perceptible stimulus properties. And I'll also argue that this sustains a robust distinction between the subjective mental appearances and a distinct mental reality that underlies those appearances. Two stimuli are J and D, if but only if they are distinguishable, but they would not be distinguishable if they were any closer physically. So to generate a space of J and D stimuli, one can start with any stimulus at all and simply work outward one by J and Ds. This just gives us a space of discriminable stimuli. But to distinguish stimuli, one must be in states that differ qualitatively, each corresponding to one of the stimuli. So we can infer from discriminable stimuli to mental qualities that make those discriminations possible. The space of J and D stimuli therefore also fixes the mental qualities. This works for stimuli of color, sound, odor, pain, and so forth, but it also works, contrary to Austin Clark, and I'm not sure about Andrew, it also works for sizes, shapes, and locations, and for temporal properties that are perceptible by each sensory modality. And it also accommodates metamers, which are a complication, but it accommodates them. And we get as a side effect that modalities are distinct if no stimulus accessible by one is just noticeably different from a stimulus accessible by the other. Mental qualities don't always correspond to stimuli. In the memory color effect, a gray banana stimulus will elicit a yellow mental quality. And in simultaneous color contrast and in assimilation, so-called, mental quality hues interact and become distorted. But J and D testing factors out such effects so that discriminable stimuli and elicited mental qualities match very well. And stimulus J and Ds alone can determine the properties of each quality space. Testing J and Ds takes forever, so nobody uses this methodology. Typically, people use shortcuts such as multidimensional scaling, which relies not on J and Ds at all, but on subjective judgments about comparative similarity along several conscious mental conscious mental qualities. That generates workable quality spaces that do very well for practical and illustrative purposes, but for a theoretical understanding of the nature of mental qualities and of how to individuate them, such a methodology falls short. We have, for one thing, no experimental control over subjective similarity. We have experimental control about similarity of stimuli, but not subjective similarity. So relative similarity judgments among mental qualities are inevitably impressionistic, and so not replicable in a serious way or reliable. It isn't even clear, I think, what subjective similarity really consists in independently of stimulus JNDs. So any way of tightening things up would likely appeal to JNDs between stimuli. The serious theoretical understanding of mental qualities is going to have to rest on JNDs so construed. All this has significant implications. Since a theoretical account of mental qualities appeals to JNDs between stimuli, our grasp of the nature of mental qualities will have to rely on the role mental qualities have in discriminating stimuli. And this conflicts with prevailing fashion on which we have to understand mental qualities by what it's like, that is, by subjective first-person access. But common sense, I would argue, binds mental qualities even more tightly to discriminative ability than it binds mental qualities to consciousness. What would a mental quality be at all without that tie to discrimination? And we discriminate stimuli unconsciously as well as consciously, bracket whether to call that perception for people who don't like unconscious perception. So understanding mental qualities by their role in discrimination makes clear theoretical room for unconscious mental qualities. One who favors understanding mental qualities by what it's like might push back and contest whether we have to construe JNDs in terms of stimuli. JND testing gives us, after all, a reliable match of discriminable stimuli with mental qualities. So why not just construe those JNDs as being between the mental qualities themselves without the initial reliance on stimuli, as Nelson Goodman seems to do in the structure of appearance. But JNDs between mental qualities would be oblique, subject to the unreliability of introspective processing, whereas stimulus JNDs rely simply on uncomplicated sensory discrimination. And striking empirical evidence sustains this worry about introspective processing, and so supports construing JNDs as being between stimuli as against conscious mental qualities. Subjects are, strikingly, significantly less accurate and also slower when they're instructed to match color qualities as such than when they're instructed to match how an object itself looks. We're better at identifying stimuli than we are at identifying the states that enable us to identify stimuli. So how we conceptualize qualities actually turns out to affect how well we can identify them. Conceptualizing the qualities as stimulus properties facilitates, whereas conceptualizing the qualities by what it's like actually makes us slower and less accurate. And as already noted, we fix JNDs by varying stimuli to see what's discriminable. Since our experimental control is just over the stimuli, that's what's operative. Also, JNDs are actually more fine-grained than what it's like. So two color patches can be consciously seen as identical, but nonetheless distinguishable when subjects are instructed to match with another sample. So JND-based quality spaces reflect our discrimination of stimuli, not conscious mental qualities. Experimentally, we can think of subjects as being like measuring devices, registering responses to stimuli, much as thermometers register ambient temperature. Some hold that we have direct, reliable access to what it's like, perhaps by way of some type of acquaintance. But the experimental findings just cited don't bear that out, nor is it clear what other empirical findings might do so, nor what else might support that view. Discrimination is imperfect, and discrimination also varies with time and how much coffee you've had and so forth and so on. So discriminable stimulus properties are never perfectly precise, but always cover a small region of physical properties. Correspondingly, no mental quality is perfectly precise. So we're going to have to use something like the very elegant machinery for regions that Andrew Lee has developed in his recent modeling metal qualities paper, which is something everybody should read at least once. Lee's usefully discusses the way in which relative precision of metal qualities reflects how fine-grained discrimination is. For example, parafoveal metal qualities are less precise than foveal metal qualities. But Lee also, if I understand him, individuates metal qualities by what it's like. So he sees some metal qualities as imprecise only relative to other wholly precise metal qualities. Whereas what I'm arguing is that stimulus JNDs make every metal quality imprecise, each relative to a tiny range of indiscriminable stimuli. And stimulus JNDs help do some things with Lee's apparatus. Lee's apparatus lets us compare, for example, disparate degrees of precision. But such degrees may not be readily comparable if the degrees are fixed subjectively, whereas if the degrees are fixed by stimulus JNDs, then we have the basis for clear comparisons. Consciousness is metal appearance. It is the way our metal lies subjectively appear to us. But if one held that we must understand metal qualities by what it's like, it will then seem that the metal appearances of consciousness wholly exhaust any relevant metal reality. Thus, Thomas Nagel, the idea of moving from appearance to reality seems to make no sense when it comes to conscious experience. If we knew about metal qualities primarily by the way they're conscious, there would be no relevant metal reality independent of the subjective appearances. Consciousness, after all, can't reach past those metal appearances. But stimulus JNDs let us fix metal qualities instead by their role in discrimination. And the role of metal qualities in discrimination is a distinctively mental reality, and it's different from the subjective metal appearances that metal qualities exhibit when they do occur consciously. If the properties that enable discrimination were merely subpersonal, the reality they constitute would, of course, not be distinctively metal, and we wouldn't have this distinction that I'm talking about. But metal qualities would then be psychologically idle, which strikes me as an extraordinarily high price to pay for construing these properties as merely subpersonal. Why then do so many still deny an appearance reality distinction when it comes to consciousness? We shouldn't just say in answer to that question, oh, well, intuitions. That's because intuitions mainly challenge tacit, unstated theoretical commitments. And what we need to do is identify and assess those commitments. It's often assumed that since physical reality is mathematically describable, colors, sounds, and other properties like that can't be physical properties. I think that this assumption is highly uncritical, but it leads to a certain strategy for dealing with the idea that physical reality is mathematically describable, namely the strategy of relocating physical colors and other such properties into the mind. Colors are then simply mental properties, not physical at all. But physical colors would be problematic only if we conceive of them as they subjectively appear to us. If we conceive of them independently of the way they subjectively appear to us, there's nothing problematic about them at all and no reason to relocate. So here is the way things are going. The idea behind this relocation story is people think that the colors have to be relocated. And since they think that colors have to be relocated, they're thinking of the colors as we're aware of them. So if we relocate physical colors as they subjectively appear to us into the mind, we will then automatically also conceive of the relocated mental properties as they appear to us. So the relocation response to the alleged problem with physical colors results in mental appearances exhausting mental reality and also in intrinsically conscious mental qualities. But common sense physical colors plainly occur even when they're not being seen. So how they appear to us can't be essential to them. There simply is no problem for the relocation move to solve. We should accordingly think of mental qualities as sometimes conscious, sometimes not, which as a final flourish, I'm representing as a final step in the Galilean revolution. Thank you very much.
David, we have time for 2 questions.
It's all true.
Oh, yes. Thank you, David. Always enjoy your presentations and reading your papers. With color and the question of relocation, how would you address the issue that our assumption is that color is related to wavelength? But if we just press our eyeballs, we experience color. So we are getting those mental qualities without having any benefit of light waves entering our eyes.
So the line that I had earlier in the talk was we should talk about the stimuli, and given a quality space for the stimuli, quality space for discriminable stimuli, we can then extrapolate the properties that make those discriminations possible, and I identified those properties as mental qualities. Now, when you press your eyeball, you're producing mental qualities, even in the absence of normal stimuli. According to me, there are both common sense colors out there. I think that they can indeed be understood in terms of wavelengths, but they are still common sense colors, and they don't need to be relocated. And there are, in addition, mental qualities of colors. So I don't see a problem with that.
Is there any further question? Then I can just be saying, David again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
So the last speaker for our panel is Johannes Kleiner with a talk titled Unifying Spaces for Conscious Experiences, very fitting into the symposium.
Yeah, thanks very much. So since David was so kind and hurried up a little bit, I can take time to thank the organizers of the conference. I think it's amazing. As I said before, I think it's the best one in a long time. Sorry to everyone else who organized the other ones. Next year's might be really nice too. Yeah, and thank you also the co-organizers of the symposium. I'm really glad we did this. And now for the final sad end, probably. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about unifying spaces of conscious experiences. So you've heard a little bit about this. So let me just try and grab everyone again. So the background of the scientific study of consciousness, more or less, are theories of consciousness. And just to bring everyone to the same page, so what theories of consciousness do most fundamentally is that they have some sort of physical description of, say, the brain or something else, and they want to link that somehow to conscious experience. And for the purpose of this talk, what I mean is, in Andrew's metaphor, I mean the illuminated room, what it is like, phenomenal character. You can then pick what you would like to call subjectivity once you have the theory. You know, it might be phi or global workspace. And I think there's much to be said about this, but here really think about the illuminated room. And the point of this, I think the point of all of these spaces really is that we need descriptions for conscious experiences. And I use the term descriptions just to have something not loaded. So it could be a representation, it could be a model or a modeling of conscious experiences. I'm just trying to be very general. So there's a ton of descriptions and they've been really great. So we have language descriptions like being conscious or not being conscious, perceiving a stimulus consciously, experiencing a particular quale. And we formalize these. So for example, we work with binary choices, we work with larger sets, for example, to describe the perception of various stimuli, and we work with the infamous positive real numbers in IIT, but also elsewhere to model sort of the amount of consciousness and how conscious something is. And as I said, so I think we've made a lot of progress, or in fact, I should say like the founding fathers and the people who ran the labs. There's a lot of progress already, but I think it's also fair to say that all of these ways are sort of limited accounts of phenomenal character. So we need something more. And the idea to use mathematical spaces for something more came up virtually in every single discipline. So here's a bunch of figures, and I apologize to all the philosophers and mathematicians that are not on here. We don't make good pictures, so we have to sort of work with the pictures the experimentalists do. So there's a bunch of them. We're going to revisit one or two. And the fundamental, so what I want to say first is, before I say any meaningful context, so what are the fundamental hopes and visions as far as I can see? As I already said, well, there are new and potentially maybe better ways of describing or representing or modeling phenomenal character. Maybe these tools will allow us to cope with the richness and details of phenomenal experience, or at the very least, they will allow us to account for the structure of consciousness, which undoubtedly is there, but there's more. And I think what we already saw in Catherine's talk is that there are experimental possibilities. There are questions, but there are also avenues, which might take us a long way further to understanding consciousness. And what I really care about is they will also help us to make more predictive and more explanatory theories. And the fundamental reason behind that is that it's just very easy to come up with any sort of theory that maps something in the brain to 0, 1. You just need a function or a mode or a property, and then you got 0, 1. And if you think that being conscious versus not being conscious is more or less a binary choice and nothing else, well, that's simple. It's very easy to come up with a theory of consciousness. Whereas it's extremely hard to come up with a theory that maps to a space if that space has independent motivation, like is the case, for example, in David's talk. And I think that's the fundamental reason why these theories, they will be more explanatory and more predictive, but it's also hard to make them. Fun joke, Lucas, in case you're here, this is actually a recent Google stuff on odor, since you mentioned that in your talk, but anyway. Okay, so, but there's a huge but. The but is that all of these wonderful approaches, which we have around I would say around the globe in the various fields, they use different concepts. We're going to see some of them. And they not only do they have different structure, but they have different types of structure. Yeah, they have metric spaces, topological spaces, and many other things. So the goal of my talk really is just to present to you a fundamental methodology to compare and then also to unify the existing proposals. So the fundamental aim is really to move towards, hopefully, eventually, a shared formal language and towards synergistic applications. So right now we're in a situation where if you do research with spaces, you have to make your own space and think about it. And this talk ultimately is aiming to getting to a situation where you could just look sort of maybe on GitHub and download your favorite space, which someone else did, and you can run your experiment and you can get data in an easier, but also maybe in a more meaningful way even. Okay. So we want to compare spaces. So here are 3 spaces. This is the Scilab color space, which everyone loves. I'm going to take it as a quality space. I don't actually know whether it is one. It's a debate you can have. But let's just take it. This one is this wonderful principal odor map with Google came up with last year. And this one is the famous phi structure of IIT 4.0. And so we want to compare these things. But then we look at their structure. So quality space is a metric space. This odor map is actually a vector space. And phi structure, phi has actually lots and lots of structure, but the phenomenal structure really is relations in IIT 4.0. The rest is phenomenal distinctions. And we cannot compare these things. Yeah, you don't know how to make sense of the idea that a metric structure should be in here, if you think about it carefully. And the goal of the talk is to develop or to show you a methodology of how you can. And in order to do that, we're going to have to take a little bit of a formal perspective. There's 2 slides, so please bear with me. This is the first one. You're going to see something nice, and then the second one is going to come. And it's also not that difficult. So this is if you look at the proposals that are out there today, in each and every single one case, you find the following structure. So first, they all somehow relate to conscious experiences. Like, for example, just the set of all color perceptions of the standard observer. So I'm just going to denote that by E. Second thing you'll find in each and every case is that they have some concept. It could be qualities, qualia, phenomenal distinctions, phenomenal states, and there are more. But they have some concept. And these concepts are very different. They have different meanings. They have different intentions. And the only thing we care about in the formal axiomatic perspective is that in each and every case, for every single experience, you have a bunch of these things. For example, you might have one color quality in a particular situation in a lab. And so just to have a neutral term, I'm just going to call these things aspects. And the point is, for every experience in E, you have a set of aspects. Yeah, so aspects is just a placeholder term. And just for the next slide, we're going to define curly A as just a union of all of these things over the set of experiences which you have. So those are all aspects in your experiences. And the final thing which you have then, and that's the thing we, in a sense we really care about, is the structure. So you have either relations or functions, and they are on subsets of the set curly A. And this is the structure you have. And so if you put that all together, it gives you a structure in the sense of mathematics. So it's a mathematical structure. You have some domains and some relation or function symbols. But the point of the slide is it's not just that. There's this additional axiomatic structure behind that, and we'll make use of that. Okay, so just a very quick example, metric space. Everyone knows that metric space, that's a metric space. That's also the Scilab. Scilab just has the best pictures. I think that's why we all like them. A metric space is something, it has a set of points, like these are the dots here. It has a copy of the real values. So they're supposed to represent distance values. And in the case of consciousness, experience distance. And then you have the metric function, which just takes 2 points and gives you the actual distance between them. So that's exactly the scheme which we just saw. You have the domains and you have one structure in a narrow sense. And then you also have axioms, but those are just conventions, like what to name things, basically. Okay, so we want to compare these things. We have many different things which all have these structures. How do we do that? And it's a very complicated question. And luckily, we can steal the actual ingredient from physics. In physics, there's a long debate about which theory is better if they're all, just because experiments are so far removed from the interesting theories, you want to have arguments which just determine which theory is better independently of experience nowadays. And that's the debate about structural parsimony. Your theory is better if it has less structure. And there's a whole debate raging around how you can actually define that. And we're just going to steal the best answer in this whole range. So how to compare different mathematical structures. And I'll say that now because otherwise I forget. So the whole reason I think this is a meaningful question is because I don't think that any one of the people working with spaces has the right answer. I think there are good things in every single one space. So we want to compare and unify them. Okay, that's the second formal slide. I'm going to use a term which I'm going to explain just subsequently. It's the term of automorphisms. That's sort of the currency of mathematical structure. So I'll say what that is in just a second. Here's the condition. So let S1 and S2 denote two structures in the sense we just defined them. They're structures in the sense of mathematics. For example, S1 is phi structure of IIT, S2 is Scilab color space. And here's the condition which we just steal from another debate, which went on for long, so that's very convenient. And I'm going to say what it means. So the definition is the structure S1, which is IIT, has at least as much structure as the structure S2, if and only if the following condition holds. And the condition says that the automorphism group of the structure S1 is isomorphic to a subgroup of the automorphism group of S2. I'm going to explain what that means in a minute. But before I do so, let's ask, what are automorphisms? Yeah, they come up because they play a huge role. And you can ask the formal question. So formally speaking, automorphism is just a mapping from the domain to the domain which preserves the structure. But what about consciousness? And here, the axiomatic structure of all of these proposals come in, because in the case of consciousness, automorphisms are actually variations of conscious experience. A variation is just a change. I have one experience and then I have another one. That just follows from the axiomatic structure. And what I really like about this, variations is not an abstract concept, but it's a concrete concept. you can think about and ponder upon variations in the realm of introspection, eidetic variation, imaginary variations in the sense of Husserl. You can do experimental things like stimulus changes or variations, do interventions like TMSing your brain is a variation. And of course, you can all do all sorts of theoretical stuff. So we have a notion which pops up in that debate, which is very meaningful for consciousness. And so what this condition, which I just shows, allows us to do, it's just, that's how it is with math. It's just one line, but it gives the whole methodology of comparing structure. We can wonder whether IIT, in fact, as I think everyone who works on IIT hopes, contains the Scilab color space in some sense. Yeah. And just as a side note, Dave has this wonderful term of the Rosetta problem. Like someone's supposed to say what this all means. And like if you find that this condition is satisfied, so that this structure indeed has at least as much structure as this one, which means in a sense that it contains it, well, then it actually gives a partial solution to that, because this structure is anchored in experiments. We understand what that is. And so there's an avenue here. Okay. But so that's what this condition means. But okay, the problem is really, I mean, what if they're not comparable? And that's the standard case, I think, which we'll have. Like, and that means sort of, I should say, so what if it's not the case that one of the structure has more structure, so contains the other? What do we do then? Well, that's the question of unification. And we'll have to ask, how do we do this? How do we unify various different structures into one? And also here, variations point at the right direction. They point at what the mathematical structure of conscious experience is. And when I say that, I don't mean what the actual structure is that conscious experience has. I mean basically what this term means. Yeah, what does this term even pick out? And that's an important point, because experience is not in any intrinsic sense mathematical. You see some geometric shapes if you know them, but the experience doesn't have a metric structure. Like it's not given as a mathematic structure, but it's given with variations by nature. And so I'm going to show you how this works, but here's the upshot, just because that's going to be slightly technical again. So the upshot really is that the mathematical structure of conscious experience, no matter whether it's topology or metric, is the structure that gives conscious experiences variation. That's the fundamental ingredient, and I'll explain to you how that will actually allow us to unify spaces. Okay, so how does it work? So I'll try to make, okay, so here's a quick side note. I won't go into this. So you can actually look at what the conditions are that have been applied in order to justify one rather the other structure, like why metric spaces, yeah, rather than topological spaces. And if you do that, you find there are certain problems which show anyway that we have to be a slightly more general. And all I'm going to say now is just an extension of the old definition by one additional ingredient. And I'm going to explain it not formally, but in pictures. So the situation which we're in is that prima facie, we have mathematical language. We don't know whether math had anything to do with the reality. It's just as good as English on the one hand, and we have concrete conscious experience on the other hand. And we want to understand what the conditions are for applying this to this. And what we get for free from all of the previous proposals, and also just the thinking we did in terms of axiomatic perspective, is that we can build a set A, which we called aspects of qualities or qualia or whatnot. Yeah, so we get this baseline connection for free. A formal thing, a set, has to do with something in experience. And now we can build upon this to actually just understand what structure means holistically. So what we'll do is we'll take here a mathematical structure that dot just represents a mathematical structure now. And what we'll do here is we'll represent one aspect of conscious experience. Yeah, it could be something like relative similarity, experienced relative similarity. And the whole point is that on both sides, we have the variation, as we've seen in the axiomatic part. So we have variations over here, just because it's math and we can consider these mappings. And we have variations over here, which are just changes of conscious experience. And when you change your conscious experience, your quality or the qualities which you had also change. That's why a change of conscious experience is really just a mathematical mapping like that. So we have one and the same sort of thing on both sides. And the only thing we have to do now, we have to make sure that we do the right sort of identification. And there isn't any question about which one we should use. On the side of mathematics, when it comes to structure, the interesting question is whether that structure whether a variation preserves a structure, which is exactly the homomorphism, or if it goes to itself, the automorphism condition. So that's the only meaningful question we can ask on the math side. And on the consciousness side, the only meaningful question we can ask is whether a change in consciousness, in conscious experiences, whether it changes a particular quality or not. And then the only thing we have to do is we have to put an identity in here and say basically the condition for applying this structure, or for saying that this structure is a structure of conscious experience, is that all the variations that's preserved that structures are exactly all the variations that do not change a specific aspect. And what I want to do in this talk for the purpose of time is just show you how this gives a very neat little definition, which is just the old one extended by one ingredient. But just to keep in mind, so the idea is really that sort of these structures are supposed to match variations, like the mathematical structure of consciousness is that structure which gives the variations that consciousness actually has. So here's part of the definition. We don't have time for that. And so let me just wrap up by explaining how that furnishes a unification of spaces. So here again, we have the Scilab color space, which is a wonderful space for visual perception, I would argue, maybe even, for the purposes of this talk, it's a quality space. And here we have this wonderful space for odor, for smell. And we want to unify them. We want to have one space. And so as we discussed before, the structure is very different, so we don't know how to put that in. I use the same symbol here accidentally, but even the sets on which they operate are different. So they are different sets, but they're also different in meaning. So we have to think carefully about this. And how it works is just that you apply what we just learned about what it means to talk about structure, even in the first place. And what you get is, for both of these structure, you get an aspect, something in consciousness that behaves exactly like the structure should in terms of variation. And I called it AD for the little metric symbol and A plus for the plus in here. Of course, you'd get one for scalar multiplication too. And now we're done, because these are just elements of this set curly A, which we introduced. So you can take the union of a set. You take the union of this set, and maybe there are more coming if the structure is richer. And then you reverse the whole construction and you now have two things, and you look for what in the realm of mathematics behaves in the way that these things behave. And that's really nice, because you can do this on both sides. You can either ask, like in terms of the concepts, the type of concept you applied here, qualities, and the type of concept you applied here, qualia, and you can sort of and you can then get a structure which which contains both of the structures in a sense. And just as a last final remark, so this condition which you showed you in terms of automorphisms, that's meaningful in terms of what we do here of unification, in the sense that if it is indeed the case that S1 is a more general structure than S2, then it turns out that this aspect which you get from A1 covaries with the aspect you get from A2, which means sort of whenever A1 is an aspect of an experience, so 2 is A2. Yeah, and that's all I wanted to say. So let me just wrap up. So the fundamental things I like to take home messages are, so first of all, I think spaces are a novel tool for consciousness science. And I think they may have lots of impact, for example, for theories of consciousness, for experiments, and potentially, who knows, for philosophy. But the research is very fragmented right now. And I think there's lots of potential, just which can't unfold itself because of this fragmentation. What this research, which I showed you here, is trying to do is trying to develop means to compare and unify these spaces. And ultimately, I would hope that also with everyone else, we could move towards a more synergistic way of applying these spaces. Ideally, in a way where people do what they can do best, and you don't have to make your own space if you want to run an experiment. And in thinking about this, I've also made a quick note about mathematical structure of consciousness and how we would actually, how I think we should or need to think about this. Yeah, that's it. Thanks very much.
So
there's a hard one.
I'll be sharing the questions here. So first question from Ned.
So what do you do about the problem that there may be an important feature of a domain that doesn't vary? So just to give an example, it might be, so you might have one whole set of qualitative properties that are visual and another set that are auditory. And, you know, in principle, you can maybe perhaps make a creature that for which they have the same structure, but they don't vary. The one individual domain doesn't vary from visual to auditory.
Yeah. So if it were metaphysically the case that something couldn't vary in principle, then you couldn't capture it with this with mathematical structure really. But I can only say, like, as far as, I mean, so here's Martina Nina Rümelin, for example, and she says that sort of qualitative character is the thing that co-varies with experiences, whereas subjective character, that's a different notion of subjectivity, doesn't. So the only thing where I really feel bad about and which I really would want to know more is subjectivity in that sense, which we have in all experiences, you know. So how can we capture that? And that's a good open question. But ultimately really it depends on if there are metaphysical restrictions, there might be impossibilities to that methodology. That's right. Yeah.
Other questions? Josh?
This is going to be, I'm a little out of my depth, but never stopped me before. So, I'm reading a book by Mark Wilson, the philosopher of science at Pittsburgh, about multidimensional scaling in physics.
Yeah.
And he argues that you shouldn't try to unify, or at least that's not really what happened in the foundations of physics at the turn of the 20th century. And instead, you should sort of, leave these spaces separate if they're working where they work, and then find ways to bridge them. So maybe the dream of grand unified theory here is maybe going too far.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. I love the example of physics. Thanks for the question, because I think it's very important to note that we're in a very, very different situation than physics. Physics has A, a long history of spaces, so you know what you talk about, and B, the spaces in physics, like the physical theories, are so sort of constrained that the choice of space has implications for your predictions. And the situation in which we're in, I think, in consciousness science is much more early. We're just trying to get a reasonably good descriptor of the phenomenon. And I think ultimately we might end up in this place.
Time for one more question. Gabe?
Yeah, this is somewhat transitory, but just on the way the way you're talking about having more structure, I just want to be clear. So having more structure is defined in terms of a subset relation on the automorphisms. And that also, it seems to me that entails that there could be situations in which intuitively one space has a lot more structure than another. For instance, my visual phenomenology has a lot more structure than, say, if I had a limited auditory system that just detected whether there was a sound or not. But it's perfectly possible that those two structures, neither one, because it's defined in terms of a subset relation, neither one could be a subset of the other. I just want to make clear that in the kind of intuitive sense of having more structure, one system could have way more structure than another in the intuitive sense, but wouldn't satisfy the has at least as much structure, because that's really about, that has at least is more like a definition of is a substructure of, or some sense like that. Is that how that works?
So roughly, so here's one important, this star here means isomorphic to, and that's really important in the whole debate. So it's not, you don't have to be a subset, but you have to be isomorphic to a subset. But roughly speaking, I think your intuition is completely right. Like, I wouldn't expect that the auditory space, so the auditory space, as you follow Clark's methodology, it's hugely dimensional, because in vision, you combine two colors, you get a third one, which you already had. In audition, if you combine two pitches, you get a chord, which you didn't already have. So it's a high dimensional space. And so it might be much richer. Still, we do not expect that the visual space is in any meaningful sense a substructure of the auditory space. So I think your intuition is precisely on spot.
And so will the visual space have at least, will the auditory space have at least as much structure as the visual space?
No.
Sounds like you're saying no.
No, exactly. Okay. And the whole point about unification is, how do we deal with these things? How do we deal with the fact if we don't satisfy that condition?
Okay, so in the last few minutes, we're going to have all of the speakers come up and have a short panel where we'll take questions from the audience to all of us.
Sounds good, yeah. Cool. So can we just, I think someone stole a few chairs. Vanya, you stole a chair, so I think it's easy if we just have a few chairs right here and try to see. So just to emphasize, the point of this last part is really for you to ask questions which are not directed at any single talk, but maybe general questions or questions about the relations of these proposals, or anything you have in mind for that matter. So does anyone have a question?
Miguel?
Yeah, thank you. So it's mostly to Andrew, but it's the way in which we conceptualize dimensions. So I think it can be open. It's also related to some of David's work. So it was very, very nice and very illuminating, but I have some issues with the analogy that you use of the light. So I was surprised. So you distinguish the subjectivity and the phenomenal character. And at the beginning, my fault, I was hearing something like the distinction between subjective character and qualitative character, in which the subjective character is supposed to capture the distinction between conscious and unconscious states, and the qualitative character, the changes in the experience. But then when you come to talk about higher theory, you say that it is multidimensional. And then I was puzzled. And then I came back to your metaphor, and then I grasped it, because you have the light, and there are different ways in which we can see the light. So these things seem to have some limits, because we want to distinguish theories that thinks that consciousness is all or nothing, from theories that says that there are degrees of being conscious. And I'm not sure whether the distinction that you want to do between subjectivity and phenomenal character, why couldn't a theory just have all the dimensions in the light, like to use an analogy, like a film projector? And that's, for example, my reading of some understanding of higher theory. So where you have all the things in the subjectivity and nothing in the illuminated room. So what is the advantage of one way going of the other? Because you really wanted to advocate for that. Thank you.
Well, so on the way that I'm thinking about this, that would just be one view about the relationship between subjectivity and phenomenal character. So I think that on the most natural interpretations of most current theories, it's not going to be the case that all differences in subjectivity capture all differences in phenomenal character. But you could have a view like the kind that you just described, where there's nothing but the inner light, and the inner light has all sorts of different ways in which it could be. However, I think if you look at current theories, then there's a very natural way in which you can disentangle subjectivity and phenomenal character. I gave the example for the workspace. For high order theory, one natural way to think about it is a distinction between being the object of a higher order thought versus what the content of the higher order thought is. And in general, I'm thinking that subjectivity depends on the question, what makes a state or a system conscious? That's part of what defines subjectivity. And for most theories, that itself will not fully determine phenomenal character.
So yeah,
maybe that's all.
Can I pitch in too? So I find this question really interesting, and you're invited too. Let's just try to have a discussion. And so, like, for example, like I think we talked about this before. So I think fundamentally we're all interested in the illuminated room, what it is like, right? That's the thing you're trying to target. And then it might or might not be the case that you find a good property in your theory, which isn't the theory itself, right? Would you agree with that? Like, for example, phi isn't the property in IIT because you need the whole theory.
Well, I guess I'm interested both in subjectivity and phenomenal character, and I think different people in consciousness research are more focused on one or the other.
Wouldn't you say that sort of it's like, wouldn't you say that the subjectivity is also always derived from the theory? You have the theory first, and then you have subjectivity in your sense. Then you try to find the property.
That's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think we might be using theory in a different way. I think you're using theory to mean a theory of phenomenal character, whereas I'm intending to use theory in a very neutral way. So for example, I think that on some interpretations of global workspace theory, global workspace theory is not yet a theory of phenomenal character, because you have to combine it with some theory of, say, representations and what determines the contents of representation.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Can you use a microphone, because there might be someone in the other room? Yeah. If it doesn't work, it's fine. Yeah. Sorry?
Every difference along that dimension is a difference in the property of which is a dimension. And so you might have a kind of a demanding way of reading that, which sticks close to, say, color space, where so every difference in color space is itself a difference in color. And that's a demanding way of reading things because, for example, there are going to be ways of thinking about consciousness where there are variations, systematic variations in consciousness that don't meet that constraint. So suppose you're like a pure intentionalist, right? So you think that differences in consciousness are differences in the contents that you're related to. Then those differences are not by nature mental or conscious differences, they're just different contents, right? So what makes the difference between two conscious states could be something non-mental. So it wouldn't, as a result, it wouldn't meet like a strong reading of variation. Now, if you could adopt a kind of weaker reading of variation, but then that looks to me like I don't quite see how it rules out the Vegemite case. And this is really for everybody, because I'm thinking, look, one way of thinking about the beginning of David's talk is that there's an alternative which treats differences in consciousness, which enable differences in discrimination, as not being essentially mental differences in an analogous way. So what do you guys think of that how we should understand variation and how that relates to David's proposals?
I'll try to just say a couple of short things so that we don't get too much into the weeds. So here's one thing that I think is very plausible. Any difference in a dimension of consciousness is a difference in consciousness, and any difference in consciousness has to be a difference in what it's like. Those seem to be analytic principles to me. In the example that you gave concerning intentionalism, so in other words, a theory where to be conscious is to experientially represent some contents, and the character of experience is determined by the contents that one represents. The way I would think about it is that differences in, it's not differences in the contents that are relevant, but differences in the contents when they're the object of the experiential representation attitude. This is starting to get a little bit technical, but we could talk afterwards about like the details, because I don't want to take up too much time on that principle.
David, do you have any thoughts to add on that? No, okay, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you so much for the talk. So I'm very interested in ways of adjudicating in a principled manner how we think about the axes once we have a space or multiple spaces. So often with color spaces, we talk about variations in hue and saturation, but there are other axes that we could use that also capture differences among color experience. So I was wondering if any of you have thought about how we could have a principled way of saying, let's say we have 3, 4, 5 different ways of orienting axes for a particular color volume. Do you think there are ways of adjudicating between those different axes, or do you think maybe following something that I think follows from your work, Johannes, that they might just be variations of maybe a superstructure, and the superstructure is really what's important, and it doesn't matter where the axes are situated?
So yeah, so I'll just say what I think, but then we should also give room to David and Catherine for the next question. So I think it's a wonderful example because there's lots and lots of structure which we always use, which is not in any meaningful sense structure of conscious experience. And on my view, without having studied this carefully, axis would be an example. And that's just different. That's just basically a property of how you mix up your stimulus. And it doesn't have anything to do with consciousness. It's like, yeah. Does anyone else want to add? So otherwise we have further question. Go ahead.
I'll just say very quickly, I think that's a great question. I guess my attitude towards this is that this is not a question specifically for consciousness science. It's a question that's applicable to consciousness science, but it's a more general question for the philosophy of science and just science about how we adjudicate between different models.
Yeah, perfect. All right, please.
I'll direct this to Catherine.
Rest of face.
Oh, yeah, okay. Just to mix it up.
Absolutely.
But as a general thing, you know, I'm a fan of the dimensional views of consciousness. I think this whole thing was great. But one reason I think it might be a really useful way to move forward, apart from the fact that I think it's correct, is that it might actually help if we as a field start thinking more about which different aspects of sort of dimensions of conscious people are talking about, not in that more so that there's less of a sort of adversarial approach. You know, I mean, we've got famous adversarial approaches that, well, if one person is right, the other person is necessarily wrong. And one thing that I wouldn't embrace a dimensional view of consciousness just so that more people can be correct. But if it allows more people to sort of, I guess, less, well, if this piece of result, this data is correct, doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else's data is incorrect or somebody else's view is incorrect. And none of you really said that explicitly. So I was sort of wondering if you also think that in terms of a field, in terms of approaching, as opposed to, well, consciousness is a single thing, therefore any theory, if it differs, if two theories differ, one must be right or both might be wrong.
Maybe if I can start answering this one. So thanks. I've got actually a lot of questions in this one.
Yeah.
I will highlight one aspect of that. So far, what has been done experimentally, the results will always depend on the precise methods which we use for data reduction, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't go into any of the details, but there is a lot of recipes there. So if there are ground truths, that's a little bit difficult. But what I think is interesting is that because those techniques are mostly data-driven, we sometimes challenge some of the conceptual distinctions that have been made with not talking about 300 principles, but more general cognitive ideas. And already this is being discussed, whether this should be taken seriously or not. The example I gave for judgments of dissimilarity between node and outcast, the fact that there was no strict hierarchy between categorical levels, for instance, comes in a way as a surprise. And for the emotion thing, whether emotions are categorical or not, is a big issue in itself. So I'm not sure the field is as ready as we would like it to be so that we can start addressing it for consciousness. But I'm also not sure that at the moment we are able to make specific predictions given the type of theoretical framework we have. So my view would be rather to go on a data-driven approach, knowing the limitations of the tools at hand, which generate biases. That would be my take.
David, do you have anything to add or no?
Yeah, thanks very much. So this is, I guess, primarily a question for Catherine and David. I'm just trying to put two parts of your talks together. So David was pointing out that you could and do empirically have forced choice discriminations that could index a space, showing that people could be essentially encoding distances in a sensory space unconsciously because they're unable to stimuli might be subjectively similar, but they can still do forced choice discriminations and build up that space. And so it seems plausible that you could have representations of a space, such as the ones being talked about today, unconsciously. So then how do you deal with that for a science of consciousness that rests on the encoding of these spaces? Do you have to do what David suggested and then do a whole series of experiments on JNDs and reference those against experiments on multidimensional scaling, which seems like it's going to be challenging to do. But if you don't do that, then perhaps you're not really distinguishing between the unconscious space and the conscious space.
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but ultimately, I also think the spaces are heavily constrained by the brain structure, and the brain structure ultimately is the same for conscious and unconscious. So the fact that there are some commonalities between the unconscious space and the conscious space would not come, for me, would not come as a big surprise. Doesn't mean that there is not some additional ingredients in there, but that ultimately there are similar spaces for conscious and unconscious.
I'm not sure what to say about that. I think that the basic spaces, what I was arguing, the basic spaces are unconscious. The basic spaces are based on discriminability. And it's perfectly possible that there are spaces that an animal has, maybe a person has, that function completely unconsciously and do their thing, and it's very nice. But there are certainly, in our case, and I imagine in other mammals and beyond that, in animal life, quality spaces that function unconsciously and then become continent in whatever way. I was studiously leaving it open. How that works, I would adopt a high order theory about how that works, but for the purposes I'm just talking about the spaces. It doesn't matter how it works. It could be just magic. So the main thing that I was arguing is that the spaces have their life originally unconsciously, and then some of them will become conscious. And what I was also arguing is that, at least in principle, one could expect that the conscious spaces would probably have less fine grain than the unconscious spaces. And I think that that's, I mean, it doesn't always have to be true. People learn to make distinctions in colors. I'm not very good at making distinctions in colors. I don't have a lot of color words and so forth, but there are people who are very good at this. I imagine, however, that I can do it unconsciously, that I would respond differentially to differences in colors that I wouldn't notice consciously as being distinct.
So we have time for just maybe one more question. Does anybody have a question that's really general and that would be applicable to all speakers on the panel? Yeah.
Hello. Okay. I'd like to thank all the speakers for suggesting this formalism by which we can quantify phenomenology, especially the ideas of relations between different kind of consciousness spaces or consciousness contents. And I wanted to relate these to the efforts in the ideas in Catherine's talk about bodily signals. I thought that was quite interesting because I don't often see a discussion in theories of consciousness about consciousness that, or effects on consciousness that reside outside the brain. And I was wondering if you could like all elaborate on, you know, assuming that in a theory of phenomenology, we can also quantify or dimensionalize these bodily signals, and that people can synchronize these bodily signals, so like their respiration or their heart rate and so on. Could you see this as providing the ingredients for a theory of shared experience, maybe?
It's a yes/no question, so we could make a vote, actually. Time is short. Who's for yes? I'm undecided, actually. Does anyone
I think it depends on what is meant by shared experience exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, for example, when people are having an experience together, right? And there's a synchrony of their physical markers. So of course we don't know what is it like for me and for you to watch the film, but we're watching the same film in the same time, and it makes us respond in some ways the same and in some ways different. Could we maybe find this like intersectionality between qualia that two people have? Will we ever be able to?
I guess I would like to challenge the popular idea that none of us knows what it's like for other people. I think we do know what it's like for other people. And I mean, I think when you see red as opposed to green, I know what it's like for you. And I think you know what it's like for me. And in everyday experience, we certainly assume that. We go on the idea that these things are intersubjective. And then we go and take a philosophy course or something like that. And I'm sorry?
Or there is a dress. You remember this example?
Yeah. Oh, yes, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Everyone realized that actually we don't see the same thing.
Yeah. Well, yes, but individual people don't see the same thing also. It's not obvious that you see things that I never see when I look at the dress. But the dress evokes different experiences depending on, I don't know what, right? So you sometimes see it this way, you sometimes see it that way. It's not obvious to me that anybody else is seeing it in a different range of ways from the way I'm seeing it.
I think we're going to wrap up. So I'll just say very quickly in response to the original question. I am, I guess, sympathetic because I think that if we develop better models of individual conscious experiences, then that'll provide a basis for developing better models of shared conscious experiences. But do you have any?
I vote on this too. Yeah, my hand up. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're not just out of time, but way over time now.